talk about
So I
this.
think we'll get started. Today I'm happy to present one of our own, Dr. Jay Rosenstein, who's been a member of the department for over 20 years. So he says he does not need an introduction, and you guys should be familiar with the excellent work that he and his lab members. So today we will be talking about observational and ecoinformatics approaches in IPM research, expanding the applied insect ecologist toolkit. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. I wanted to start by thanking Kelly and the graduate students for inviting me to talk. I think all of us run around and give talks at national meetings and sometimes in other departments, but it's kind of a special treat to be able to stay at home and present some of our research things. So the goal of the work that I'd like to talk about today is basically to sort of try and open a discussion with the community of applied insect ecologists about the possible advantages of sort of broadening the toolkit that we use a bit to move perhaps a little bit away from such a strong reliance on experimental work and to think a little bit instead about the maybe complementary values of using observational approaches. And in particular, approaches that use data that are not necessarily being collected by us, the researchers, with our own hands, but potentially using data that are being generated by farmers and consultants who are working in commercial agriculture. So that's what I'll be talking about. Before I start the work, I wanted to acknowledge some of my collaborators. There are a lot of people who contributed to the work I'll be presenting. So this first group, so Sarush, Billy, Yalwani, Moran, Francis, and Tanya, were basically all members of the lab about a year and a half ago, and we all worked together to do a review of the literature that I'll present in a few minutes. So that was work that we all worked on together. The second group, Rachel, Emily, Kim, Gail, Andy, and Andrew all contributed to the experimental field work that I'll be presenting. Pete Goodell is a IPM specialist, part of the UC IPM program. He was crucial in connecting me with consultants in the industry and with farmers, so his contribution was really essential. Jim Jones, the private software developer who's here today, he designed the database that made the whole project go, so we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then this last group of individuals, Kevin Gross, Yves Carrière, and Pierre Dubreuil, are all biostatisticians, and that's a key part of the work I'll be presenting, but I won't go into it today, so I'm sort of going to really not do them justice, but the statistical issues are key as part of this work, and so that is definitely, their contributions are really super appreciated. Okay, so here's sort of a roadmap for what I'll be talking about. So first I'll try to define ecoinformatics, this approach of using data from farmers and consultants. I'll then sort of lead what I hope will be maybe a bit of a discussion about the strengths and weaknesses of experimental approaches versus observational approaches. And I'll try to focus that discussion a little bit by viewing it through the lens of a yield impact study. So one of the core studies that IPM researchers do, trying to quantify the relationship between pest density and crop yield. And then, essentially for the last chunk of our time, I'll walk through two examples that try to show how observational data sets can play complementary roles in research projects. So the first example will involve a very small, modest observational data set, and the second one will involve a larger data set coming from, again, the private farmers. And that'll essentially be my attempt to sort of share with you a proof of concept that this ecoinformatics approach can actually work. And definitely feel free to interrupt. I'm happy to field questions or hear suggestions as we go along. Okay, so ecoinformatics, what exactly is it? Ecoinformatics, I think, is sort of a growth industry right now in the field of ecology. It's new, it's somewhat ill-defined still, but I would say that most ecoinformatics studies have most, if not all, of these characteristics. First, they tend to use pre-existing data. So they're almost all, to one degree or another, an exercise in data mining. Second, they often involve integration of data from multiple sources with all of the challenges associated with dealing with heterogeneous data sets. Usually the data are observational rather than experimental. Not always, but usually. Many ecoinformatics studies allow ecologists to address ecological processes that are occurring at large spatial or temporal scales at which experimentation is often quite difficult. Finally, ecoinformatics studies often involve relatively large quantities of data, and the fact that these data sets are large and heterogeneous typically means that to do one of these projects well, we need to have novel and efficient tools for organizing the data, managing the data, so database design is crucial, and we need typically novel tools for analyzing the data, so novel statistical approaches. So ecoinformatics then in a nutshell is often an endeavor that involves collaborations between computer scientists, between statisticians, and between ecologists to address these sort of broad scale questions in ecology. Okay, so if ecoinformatics then is focused on data mining, the first and absolute prerequisite is that there has to be some pre-existing set of data that are potentially useful. And in the field of pest management research, I think we have a tremendous opportunity to adopt this approach because there is a vast quantity of pre-existing data. And these are data that come from the routine sampling efforts that farmers and consultants are doing every day, every year out in commercial agriculture. So almost all farmers are monitoring their fields to understand when they have a potentially damaging population of pests. Typically, at the end of the season, those data are either thrown away or they're put in a dusty locker somewhere. And so what we're suggesting is maybe that is a treasure trove of useful information. Because the labor-intensive job of sampling insects is decentralized, we can potentially generate a huge amount of data, much greater data sets than we could do if we as researchers have to generate those data with our own hands. But, of course, these are observational data. So they're not being generated in an experimental context, and that then opens up questions as to can we extract useful results, useful research results from these strictly observational data. So we've been sort of focused on that question, is there real value in these observational data sets, and what are the potential strengths and weaknesses of experimental science versus observational science? Of course, pest management is a diverse endeavor. There are many, many different kinds of questions that are being asked, and they are addressed with many, many different sorts of approaches. So to focus this question a little bit more, we decided to look at this issue of the relative strengths and weaknesses of experimental science versus observational science by looking at the question through the lens of the yield impact study. So the yield impact study is basically something that almost all IPM researchers have to do at the outset of a program. We need to understand at what density does a particular pest generate enough damage that it's important for a farmer to intervene to protect that crop. Okay, so I worked with members in my lab to do a little review of recently published yield impact studies. So we looked at all of the studies that were published in Journal of Economic Entomology and Environmental Entomology, two sort of bastions of applied pest management research over this 3-year period from 2007 to 2010. And these are the data that we collected. So we asked, was the study observational or experimental? So what are we doing? Were the data collected by the researchers themselves, or was it potentially collected by others? Was the research being conducted on a research farm, or was it being done in a commercial setting? We wanted to ask some questions about the spatial scale at which the work was being done. So in the case where there were experiments, what was the spatial scale of the research plot? And then finally, we wanted to gather some data on statistical power. And I'll come back to that. And the results of this review sort of gave us a sense of where are we, like what's the status quo? And what we found, not surprisingly, is that experimentation is definitely the mother's milk of pest management research. So we found 36 yield impact studies that had been published during this interval. All but one of them was an experimental study, strictly experimental. There was only one study that used observational data. In 100% of the studies where the methods were described in adequate detail, the data were collected by the researchers themselves. So we're very jealous about how we do our research. We want to be totally in control of it. And finally, most of the studies, 22 out of 25, where the methods were described adequately, we could see that the research was being conducted in a research setting, on a research farm, rather than in a commercial setting. So clearly, where the field is currently is we have enshrined the value of experimentation to a very great degree. And I think there are a lot of good reasons actually for doing that. We're all taught to do that, and I think we appreciate the manifold advantages of doing experimental science. And I've sort of tried to put up, this is sort of my top 5 list of why it's really useful to do experiments. And I don't think there are going to be any surprises here to anyone. So by far, perhaps the most important issue is the strength of a causal inference that we can derive from an experimental study. So if you do an experiment and you see a response, you know that there's a causal effect between the variable that you manipulate and the response variable. On the other hand, if you're working with observational data sets, with the Ecoinformatics approach, you're dealing strictly with correlations. We know that correlation is not the same as causation, so we're going to have challenges. Experimental approaches can also be advantageous because they're fundamentally very flexible. Any variable that we, the experimenter, can manipulate, can figure out a way to manipulate, we can explore. Whereas with observational data sets, we're sometimes going to be hamstrung because we can only work with that variation that is naturally present in the field. We're not generating that variation, so we have to just work with what we have. And we'll actually see this problem come up in one of the examples that will be presented a little bit. Another potential advantage of experimental sciences is that we, by controlling the conditions under which we do the experiment, we can reduce the between replicate variation. That then gives us greater statistical power, whereas with observational data sets, the heterogeneities create a lot of between replicate variation, and that can erode our statistical power. Another key advantage, and this was, I think, when we actually started the work and we started trying to write grant proposals, this was the key hurdle that we ran into, that reviewers said, you know, if you work with observational data, the data uniformity is going to be too low, the data are going to be incomplete, and the data quality is simply not going to be good enough. There were deep-seated concerns that the raw quality of data that were being generated by farmers and consultants was not going to be high enough to support sort of rigorous research. So that was sort of a key question. And then finally, there's an issue of the sensitivity of the data, which I don't think we fully appreciated when we started, but it's become a greater issue. That when you're doing experimental research at a farm, there's no sensitivity of the data. We generate the experiments, it's our data, there's no problem. When instead we're relying on farmers and consultants to share their data with us, you can run into some real obstacles. Farmers are notoriously secretive about their production practices and about their yield results, and so it may be, in many cases, difficult to get farmers to be willing and to have the trust level to actually share those data with us. So this is a pretty good set, I think, of advantages for sticking with experimentation. And you might conclude from this, well, you'd have to be absolutely loopy to even dream about doing anything other than experimentation. But I think that, in fact, there are some reasons, nevertheless, to think about looking outside of experimentation. And I think there are some weaknesses of experimentation that are less widely considered and less widely appreciated by the research community. And I want to try and sort of walk through some of these now. So again, I'll try and present sort of a top 5 list of why we might want to look beyond strict experimentation. So the first of these has to do with the spatial and the temporal scale at which experiments are conducted. And typically, these are small scales, much smaller than the spatial scale at which agriculture is conducted. So if we look at our yield impact studies that we saw in the literature, the mean size of the replicate plot was 37 meters squared. So that's a 6 meter by 6 meter plot, or whatever that is, 0.0037 hectares. And this is much, much smaller, of course, than the scale at which commercial agriculture is being conducted. And it's a perennial concern for ecologists that if you measure a process at one scale, it may not be a guarantee that we can simply extrapolate to a different spatial scale. But in many cases, key processes change as you change the spatial scale. There also may be a problem with the temporal scale. So when we looked at our survey of studies, we noticed that 100% of those studies involved annual crops. Now, why should that be? You can do a yield impact study with a perennial crop, but it's very difficult, because perennial crops may show cumulative effects of herbivory. There may be lagged effects of herbivory. So to do a yield impact study, you need to do a multi-year study where you maintain pest perturbations. You maintain the treatments over a long period of time. Very, very difficult. So difficult and so costly that they're done, but very infrequently. So if you want to study the impact of a pest on a perennial crop, observations may be much, much more attractive, because with observational studies, of course, the spatial and temporal scale of the research, of the data, matches exactly the spatial and temporal scale of commercial agriculture. Okay, so that's maybe advantage number one. Here's advantage number two. And this is basically taking one of the strengths of experimentation and sort of turning it on its head. What kind of applicability do we have when we're taking a recommendation derived from an experiment and trying to apply it to the broad range of conditions under which farming is actually conducted? And this can be a real problem with experimentation. We control conditions very tightly. We may have what statisticians call high internal validity, so the conclusions that we draw from the experiment may be applicable to that set of conditions under which the experiment was conducted. But we usually want to make recommendations for all of agriculture, let's say, all the farmers in a particular region that are growing that particular crop. And ecoinformatics-based approaches can, I think, do a much better job of achieving what's called external validity. That is, if you plan carefully the way you gather the data, you can gather the data from the full range of conditions under which farming is actually being conducted. So in fact, it has been suggested that rather than trying to tighten our control of conditions, that instead purposeful heterogenization of the data set may actually be a more valuable goal to seek. Okay, how about the third strength of observational approaches? This has to do with how many variables can we sort of cope with at once. And I think it's true that with most experiments we're running, we're able to manipulate and really treat just a small handful of variables at a time. You know, once you get even to 4 or 5 variables, it's going to be very, very difficult. But ecoinformatics-based approaches can potentially be useful for screening a vast number of different variables. And this can be especially important when we have IPM research projects that are not tightly focused, but rather are much more sort of in an exploratory phase. And we'll actually see an example of this in just a couple of minutes. A fourth potential advantage of observational methods has to do with how easy is it to translate the results of a research project into a recommendation for farmers. And I think this is actually a challenge that's often sort of not really contemplated so much. Researchers often are speaking a different language than the farmers are speaking. So we may do our sampling differently, we're measuring things differently. And so when we get done and we have a particular result, we have to figure out how to translate that result into the language that the farmers are speaking. In contrast, when we work with data derived directly from the farmers, there's an immediate translatability. There's no risk that something's going to be lost in translation because the raw data are exactly in the format that the farmers are familiar with. So that's, I think, another advantage. And finally, a last advantage has to do with the issue of statistical power. Just how large are the data sets going to be? For experimental approaches, the data sets are generally fairly small because we're constrained by how the data that we can actually collect ourselves. With ecoinformatics approaches, we can potentially get much larger data sets because of that decentralization of the labor-intensive business of sampling, and that holds out the promise of having greater power, at least potentially. So we wanted to look at this last issue a little bit more carefully with our literature review. And we saw that the surveys, the studies that we surveyed, there was a mean number of replicants per treatment of 4. Actually, sorry, 4. That was the median value. And the question was, is that enough? Is that really going to give us sufficient power? And as soon as you start thinking about power in applied insect ecology, you immediately run into a key challenge. And the challenge really has to do with the economics of crop production and crop protection. So here's the problem. Crops are valuable, insecticides are cheap. So let's take an example. A typical acre of Pima cotton might be worth $2,000. Okay, that's not a particularly high value crop, sort of run par for the course. A typical insecticide application that a farmer might contemplate using to protect that crop is very cheap. It might only cost $20 per acre. That includes both the cost of, let's say, flying an airplane around and the cost of the material itself. So here's the rub then. The farmer is going to be motivated to apply that insecticide if he thinks he can protect $20 worth of that crop. And that represents only 1% of the total yield in that crop, right? $20 out of 2,000 is 1%. Now, if you come to me as an experimentalist and say, I'm going to hire you to go out and measure a yield effect of 1%, my teeth are going to start chattering. Okay, that's going to make me pretty nervous. So we wanted to ask then, can we generally measure the effect sizes that really matter to farmers? Can we measure the effect sizes on yield that actually correspond to the decision point that the farmers are actually having to cope with? And so to address that question, we went back to our literature survey and we collated the relevant information. So we took out information on crop value, on the cost of insecticide application, and the key stuff that allowed us to measure statistical power, so variance and the number of replicants. And for each of these studies, we measured this thing, we calculated this, a power ratio, as the smallest proportional yield loss that we could detect with 50% probability. So this is, okay, we've got a reasonable chance of measuring an effect of this size. So this is what can we measure. And then in the denominator, the smallest proportional yield loss that would actually motivate a farmer to spray. Right? So this is the effect size that actually matters to the farmers. And of course, what we want is we want to have that power ratio be less than 1. Okay, we want to be able to measure effects that are small enough that it actually allows us to give advice to the farmer about the decision that the farmer has to make. And here's what we found. So I'm plotting here this power ratio on the x-axis. Here's the sort of magical cutoff. Okay, we want that value to be less than 1. So to the left would be sufficient power, to the right would be insufficient power. Notice that this is plotted on a log scale, so each of these categories is a 2-fold increase in this power ratio. And what you can see is it's a sad story. Okay, not one of the studies we reviewed had sufficient power to allow the researchers to actually quantify the effect size that matters to farmers. And so this, I think, then really generates a very profound disconnect between the kinds of things that we are able to document as researchers experimentally and the kinds of effects that actually matter to farmers. And because we have that profound disconnect, I think this is one of the contributors to the feedback that I think we all hear from the farming community, that they often feel that what we're doing here is sort of disconnected from reality, that we're not really bearing down necessarily on the problems that they think are most important. So I think there are many issues underlying that, but I think this is one of the contributors. Okay. So to sum up then this first sort of chunk of the talk, I've suggested that as pest management researchers, we tend to rely very heavily on experimentation. That's what we've been taught to do, and that's what we do. But experimentation, like any approach to research, has both strengths and weaknesses. Okay? The strengths are manifold and they're widely acknowledged, but the weaknesses, I think, are also there. And so I think then we have some motivation, potentially, for looking to other kinds of research approaches that can complement the strengths of experimentation. And I think, as we've seen in this little review, in many cases, the strengths and weaknesses of experimental approaches and observational approaches are actually really are complementary. Okay. So what I'd like to do now is sort of spend the rest of our time sort of walking through two sort of case studies, just two examples. And I'm hoping that both of these examples will show the potential value of using observational approaches in a sort of hand-in-hand with experimental approaches. And the first of the examples has to do with the impact of Lygus hesperus, so the key virid pest, on cotton production. And in particular, it has to do with the impact of Lygus on the plant in terms of generating immediate sort of manifestations of damage. So Lygus feeds on cotton. What it feeds on, at least the part of its feeding that generates economic damage, is when it feeds not on the flowers, but on these little tiny flower buds. So the very earliest stages in the development of a flower bud. That happens to be a place where Lygus loves to feed. And it generates damage in those flower buds, and the plant may respond to that damage by deciding to not invest any more resources in that developing flower bud. And the result is that that flower bud is of size. Okay, it drops off. So that's the basic issue was the mapping of Lygus densities to the expression of this damage, the decision of these flower buds. And to sort of set up the question, I need to do a little bit of history. So 1996 was a particularly horrendous year for cotton growers in California. There was tremendous crop damage. Pesticide bills went through the roof. Yields were low. And a lot of farmers actually went out of business that year. So it was a very, very bad year. At the end of that year, Pete Goodell called together sort of a roundtable for all of the major cotton producers to sit down together and talk about what went wrong, and then to identify research priorities for the research community. And we, the researchers, were invited just to listen, okay, not to say anything, but just to listen. So I was sitting there and listening, and I heard at that meeting an observation from the farmers that sort of stuck in my mind. And what they said was that, unlike other pests on cotton, Lygus was very curious. It created what they viewed as an enigma. And that is that sometimes they have lots and lots of Lygus in the field, but very little abscission of flower bugs. So lots of bugs, but very little expression of damage. Whereas in other fields, they had very few Lygus bugs, but they had a lot of abscission of flower bugs. And they didn't understand why. And this uncertainty, this sort of lack of clarity regarding the damage that Lygus is generating, made them very motivated to manage Lygus in a sort of hyper-aggressive way. Because they were always afraid that maybe my field is going to be the one that shows this great sensitivity to Lygus. So I didn't understand what was going on then, and I wasn't working on Lygus at that time, but I sort of saved that question. Some years later, James Hagler showed something very interesting about Lygus, which was surprising to us, which was he showed that Lygus is not a strict herbivore, but rather it's an omnivore. So it sometimes feeds as an herbivore, and sometimes it feeds as a predator. We knew from work that Anurag Agrawal had done actually here that many omnivores can switch back and forth between acting primarily as an herbivore to acting primarily as a predator. So I put these observations together and I sort of came up with my pet hypothesis, which was maybe this enigmatic impact of Lygus was due to the fact that it was shifting back and forth between acting as a herbivore and acting as a predator. So we wrote some grant proposals, we started working on this. We spent 1 year very intensively studying Lygus feeding behavior, and we found out very quickly, no, that is not the answer. It was a complete dead end. At least under conditions of California cotton, Lygus are not acting as a predator, sort of full stop. So we had to sort of go back to the drawing board, and we sat down and we said, okay, if it's not omnivory that's underlying this, what could it be? And that was a very sobering exercise, because what we realized was there's a huge number of possibilities. And we could group those possibilities under these 4 sort of classes of hypotheses. Maybe the problem is one of observational uncertainty. Maybe there's some problem in sampling the density of Lygus in fields or sampling crop damage. It could also be variable behavior of the herbivore. So Lygus acting as an omnivore is one possible basis for variable herbivore behavior, but there could be many others. It could instead be variable behavior or responsiveness of the plant. Maybe Lygus is generating a consistent amount of damage, but the plant then varies in its response to that damage. And finally, there could be what could be called model uncertainty. Maybe our basic characterization of what's going on here is wrong. And in particular, we were thinking maybe there was some other arthropod present that's also feeding on the flower buds, and that Lygus is sort of inappropriately getting the blame for the damage that this other insect is causing. So 4 classes of explanations, probably a list of specific hypotheses that is as long as your arm. What do we do? It was very daunting. How do we start with such a vast array of possibilities? And so what we decided to do was a small-scale observational study to try and screen, sort of sift through this long list of possibilities. So here's what we did. We said, let's work with farmers and consultants. As soon as they identify a field as being enigmatic in some way, we're going to get a phone call from them, and we're going to zoom down, and we're going to measure as many things in that field as we can. This was actually work that Kim Steinman here spearheaded a lot of this field work. And we measured everything that we could. We had no idea what we were doing. It was a complete fishing expedition. Okay? So we measured well in excess of 30 variables, including Lygus densities. We quantified the feeding damage, so we actually took flower buds, dissected them and we counted the number of anther sacs, so the developing male parts of the flower that were fed on, gave us a very nice way to quantify feeding damage. We measured as many things as we could about plant condition, thinking that we would potentially find a correlate with plant responsiveness to damage. And we also sampled all the other insects that were in the field to see if there was some other culprit. Very small data set. Okay, it took all summer. There was a team of 3 or 4 people working the whole time. We only managed to gather all of these data for 21 fields. So it's a very small data set for an intimidatingly large list of variables. But nevertheless, we did get some useful insights. Not rock solid conclusions, but at least some useful suggestions. So here they were. The first result was that observational uncertainty did not seem to be the key answer here. And there's sort of 2 parts to this. First, our density estimates were highly correlated with the density estimates that the farmers and the consultants were making. They're not exactly the same numbers. In fact, so we are speaking a different language. This gets back to that issue of how do you make recommendations. So we were finding, for instance, 6 times as many nymphs as the consultants were finding. Not surprising, because they have to go through these fields very, very quickly, whereas we as researchers can pick through our sweet net samples and find these very conspicuous nymphs. But nevertheless, a high density field that they sort of recognized, we would also categorize it as a high density field. When the consultants said the densities are low, we found that the densities were low. So certainly very tight agreement on that score. And furthermore, we were seeing exactly the same deviations from expected flower excision that the farmers were seeing. So their categorization of a field as enigmatic matched exactly our categorization of a field as enigmatic. So I'm plotting here the density of adult ligas in the fields versus flower bud retention. And you can see that there's a negative relationship here, but it's noisy. And sure enough, these solid symbols here are the fields that the farmers considered to have higher abscission than they would expect. And sure enough, those fields do cluster at the bottom of this sort of cloud of points. The little plus symbols here are fields that had abscission that the farmers considered to be as expected, and these open circles were fields that the farmers considered to have less abscission than expected. So basically, the way the farmers were reading this was exactly the way we would read it. So far so good. Maybe sampling isn't the problem. The second inference that we got was that it also did not seem like variable herbivore behavior was the key issue. So here I'm plotting adult ligas density versus the number of anthers that are damaged. This is a direct measure of feeding damage. And you can see that there's a positive relationship here. It's noisy, but positive. But the different categories of fields are all scrambled up together. So there's no field type effect here at all. So there's no suggestion then that the strangely high incision fields were due to those fields responding with more incision to a given level of damage. So the ligas are doing just what they're supposed to be doing. They're chewing around these squares. It also looked like we could rule out, at least tentatively, the idea that there was some other insect that was generating the damage. So what we found was that there was really one other insect that was abundant enough to be a potential culprit, and that was this guy, the big-eyed bug, Geochirus pallens. This insect is thought of primarily as a predator. It's an important biocontrol agent, but we also know that it is in fact an omnivore. It does feed on the plant. So we set up some very simple experiments to quantify plant damage by Geochirus. And yes, there was some, we could measure it, but it was so small that it couldn't possibly be responsible for the damage in squares that people were observing. So it doesn't look like there's somebody else out there. It really does look like it's ligas. And finally, this initial sort of pass did suggest that maybe it was variable behavior of the plant, a variable response of the plant to a given level of damage that was the root cause of the whole overall phenomenon. So here I'm plotting the anther sac damage, so this is the feeding damage to the squares, versus flower bud retention. And you can see that there's a downward trend here, and it's noisy. But again, and it's a little bit messy here, and this is only sort of marginally significant, that these solid symbols here, the fields that had higher abscission than expected, tended to cluster towards the bottom of this cloud of points. So the plants seem to be responding to a given level of damage with more abscission. Why? So this then motivated us to try and look carefully at all of the variables that we measured that described the plant condition. And when we did that, one variable jumped out. which was phosphorus nutrition. So here's petiole phosphate level versus the deviation between observed incision of flower buds and the expected level of flower bud incision based on the density of ligas. And what you see is this relatively strong negative relationship. Now this was completely unexpected. This was one of probably 15 variables that we measured that described plant condition. There's a very extensive literature on the physiology of abscission in cotton plants. Cotton was actually sort of a model plant for studying plant abscission responses. And nowhere in that book is there any suggestion that there might be a role for phosphorus. When we shopped this result around to the cotton agronomists, we just got shrugs. Nobody had any idea why this might be important. So we were a little bit dumbfounded by this. And given that we had done this massive fishing expedition, we didn't have any confidence whatsoever that this was real. But there it was. So we thought we should at least pursue it. And we did. And here's what we found. So the first thing we did was we generated an independent data set, observational data set, this time for actually a different species of cotton. This is Kimba cotton, Scythian bonadess. And we found exactly the same pattern. Higher levels of phosphorus nutrition, greater abscission of squares. So okay, maybe something really is going on here. I then had the good fortune of having Andrew Forbes join me on this project, a postdoc on the project. And Andrew did a very good and careful literature search and found something that we hadn't found, which was that indeed there was some precedent for a role of phosphorus in abscission responses, not for cotton, but for, of all things, olives. So work that was actually done here in the agronomy department, where they were searching for a chemical harvest aid for olives. They wanted to figure out a good way to mechanically harvest olives. So they were snipping off the tips of olive branches, sticking it in little water picks and spraying different things on those chopped off branches to see what would enhance the abscission of the olive fruit. And by accident, they found that when they had phosphoric acid in the water pick, just to maintain the pH at the appropriate level, the little branches dropped all of their leaves and fruits. Totally unexpected. There's still no explanation for this, but they've actually gone on and shown that this response seems to be very broadly found within the plant kingdom. So somehow phosphorus is having an effect, and Andrew then went on and did a tightly controlled experiment where he grew plants under low phosphorus conditions and high phosphorus conditions, and sure enough, we get a very strong variable response to damage in terms of flowers. Okay, so what I hope then I've suggested from this first example is that even a very, very small data set, 21 fields sampled, really enabled us in this case to make some serious sort of progress on this problem. We started with a long list of hypotheses. It would have been completely impossible to start with experiments to address each of those possible scenarios. Yeah?
What led you to test for phosphorus?
We just measured everything we could. This was completely undirected. There was no insight involved in this at all. None.
Yeah, but is it, a thing that they apply? I mean, is it a variable that they...
So where is this variability in phosphorus coming from? And this maybe is one of the reasons that it was even more perplexing. Typical commercial production of cotton, the cotton crop is not fertilized with phosphorus. Most people assume that there's excess phosphorus available. They don't fertilize cotton with phosphorus. So almost all of the variability that we find in the field is due to the rotational history of the field. So it depends on what was grown there before. And if that was a crop that does get phosphorus fertilizer, then there's typically higher levels of residual phosphorus in the soil. And that was actually something that we pursued with the Ecoinformatics side. So the whole thing is based on sort of history of crop rotation.
Is this something that's sort of routinely tested, say, by soil scientists?
And maybe if it had been, maybe people would have figured out long ago what was going on here. Okay, so that's the story, this first part of the story. We had this big black box, we did this fishing expedition, and the observational study really enabled us to sort through this vast range of possibilities. I had an interesting experience trying to publish this work. The editor wrote to me about this initial observational survey that it presents precious little good, hard scientific evidence. And of course, initially I was sort of aggravated by this. But on the other hand, basically I agree. It did provide precious little good, hard scientific evidence. But nevertheless, the soft evidence that it did provide us with was essential to the progress of the overall project. So we needed it even though it was soft. And so I think part of what we need to do is sort of change kind of the culture of our community to say, okay, yes, observational studies are not as rigorous and robust as experimental studies, but nevertheless, they can be useful. Okay, so, yeah.
Don't try and publish in Science with that data.
This was not science I was trying to Okay, last part. So here's an example of where a larger data set can play, I think, a particularly useful role. So this is the Ecoinformatics approach. Again, the focus here will be on the impact of ligas on cotton production. But now we're going to focus directly on the effect of ligas on yield. And let me set this question up again with a little bit of history. So there's been a long, hot controversy regarding the relationship between ligas densities and cotton yield. And most of this happened before I was, out of school. There's a long history of experimental studies, stretching back close to 50 years at this point. The important sort of bottom line from these experimental studies, there's probably been at least 10 of them, is that none of these studies has shown any yield effects for ligas at densities less than 10 per standard sweep sample, okay, which is what most people would consider to be a pretty high density. But the growers are very skeptical of this experimental result. And the growers typically treat at much lower densities, sometimes 3 to 4 ligas per sweep, sometimes lower. So this has been sort of, I would say, like a festering problem in pest management in cotton. If you have to treat for ligas, it wrecks biocontrol of all the other pests, so ligas is really sort of a key player here. But the experiments are very, very difficult to conduct. Ligas is very mobile, and it's resistant to a lot of different insecticides. It's very difficult to manipulate its densities. So we thought maybe we can approach this question by working with grower data. Let's not try to run experiment number 11. Let's try something sort of different. So the approach that we thought was, let's see if we can build a large observational data set. We knew that we were going to have some challenges here because ligas is just one of many factors that could shape yield. So we knew we were going to need a lot of data to cope with the variability in yield. So we set out to build a database. We worked with leading independent pest control consultants in the valley. Luckily, everybody samples ligas the same way. That made this much, much easier to do. And we tried to sort of diversify the data streams as much as we could. So we had data on ligas density from the consultants, crop yield from the farmers, and then we tried to add in as much as we could. So from agronomy consultants, we got information about flower bud retention, we got information on plant nutrient status. From the Department of Pesticide Regulation, which maintains this beautiful online database, we got information about pesticide use. From the farmers, we got all sorts of information about their farming practices, neighboring crops, history of crop rotation, which I've already mentioned, and the historical yield norms, which is crucial for this study. And we managed to get data for a little bit over 1,000 fields. So doing the data ourselves all summer, 20 fields, now working with other people's data, 1,000 fields. So we did quite a bit better. One key step, when I started this project, I was hopelessly naive about what was involved in building an efficient database. Jim Jones and his company, 1011 Business Solutions, rescued us. So the database that Jim designed was crucial in allowing us to work with the data in an efficient way, detect errors of data entry, correct them, digest the data, report the data. This was absolutely crucial. And the database that we ended up with has really been quite versatile. I don't have time to go through all these things today, but I want to just point out that we can use this now to do all sorts of things. So it played a role in unraveling this phosphorus ligas story. Kevin Gross did a really nice project documenting the pesticide treadmill in this system. So if you have to spray early for ligas, what are the consequences? Francis Sivikoff used a chunk of this data to analyze the landscape ecology of ligas. So what are the effects of neighboring crops? So we've really done quite a bit with this, and we're continuing to work with this. But let me now focus on the yield effects of lichens. So the first thing that we had to do was try to convince the skeptics that the basic quality of the data was adequate. And so we did that by looking at the relationship between ligas numbers and square retention. We expect a strong negative relationship here. There aren't that many things that cause plants to size squares. It's not just ligas. But we do see, happily, a very strong negative correlation here. And we see this any way we slice the data. So that was sort of reassuring to us that the data were okay. So now let's take a look at the yield effects. And I'm going to start with the month of July. I start with the month of July because that's the month during which the vast majority of the pesticide applications go on during July. And here's what we found. So I'm plotting the mean density of ligas during the month of July versus cotton yield. And again, I'm expressing this as a deviation between what we observed and what we're expecting to see based on the historical yield norms for that particular field, and also statistically controlling for year-to-year fluctuations in yield. Each point here is one field. The curvy line here is the result of a generalized additive model fit. So it's basically just a fit that follows the data. And we're not imposing any particular form of this relationship. And this shaded region is the 95% confidence interval. What you can see here is there is no effect. We cannot detect any effect of ligas densities on cotton yield when those ligas are feeding on the cotton during the month of July. So this is entirely consistent with the results of the experimental studies, which also showed no detectable effect of ligas on yield below densities of around 10. Okay, so that was sort of interesting. It's noteworthy because the farmers are spraying down here. Okay, the farmers are spraying. They're so aggressive in their response to ligas that they're treating these fields way before the densities of the ligas populations are actually threatened for their yield. And to sort of do some quick back-of-the-envelope calculations, it's probably on the order of $20 million per year that is sort of being thrown away in these unnecessary applications. So 50 years of debate about ligas impact, maybe $1 billion of unnecessary pesticide applications. And they are definitely counterproductive. They create other kinds of problems. These data also show us, I think, a key weakness in the ecoinformatics approach, which is that we know that eventually this curve is going to bend down. We've all seen fields where the yield actually just goes to zero because the ligas knock every single flower bud off the plants. But we cannot quantify that response here because the farming community is so aggressive that they never let the ligas even approach the densities at which there's actually a measurable yield impact. So this is sort of a constraint. If we had done it experimentally, we could push the densities up here, but we can't. We can only work with what we have in the real sort of setting. So let's now move 1 month earlier to the month of June. And what we see here was maybe more surprising and quite different. So what we're seeing now is a very clear negative effect of ligas density on yield and at densities that are much lower than those that the experiments identified as being problematic. So remember, the experiment said we have to be out here somewhere before we get a yield effect. But here we're seeing clear drops in yield even for painfully low densities of ligas. So the farmers were actually incurring yield loss without knowing it all of these years. Again, probably at least $1 billion in lost yield over the 50 years that entomologists have been arguing about this kind of effect.
Jay?
Yeah.
Talk for a minute about what you mean by expected and observed minus expected.
So the expected yield here is we're using the historical record of yield observed for a particular field. So we actually, and we express that relative to the valley-wide average for a particular year. And we did this because, and this is part of the statistics that I'm sort of glossing over, there are always challenges in moving from, again, correlation to causation. So we wanted to work with deviations from expectations to minimize the chance that there was some correlation between, let's say, plant vigor and ligas density. That's why we worked.
Did you look for correlations between ligas density and the stuff that was going into your expectation?
Correlations between...
As opposed to stuff that was going into your observation?
Yeah.
So you're attributing it to, it was a particularly bad year, but maybe it could be, there were more ligas that year than in other years.
Right. So there isn't any particular correlation between ligas density and the overall year. The effect of weather is huge. It has a lot to do with when they can plant the crop. Yeah. So those things I think are pretty uncorrelated.
Jay, can I ask one more?
Yeah.
The word early, how does that relate to first bloom or first bud?
This is basically pre-bloom.
Pre-bud?
It's not pre-bud. So they only start sampling ligas when the flower buds are there, because before that, nobody cares about ligus's impact. So this is basically the first flower buds are present and vulnerable typically around the end of May, which is actually included here.
Mm-hmm.
And usually the first bloom is around the end of June. So this is the earliest part of fruiting. Okay, so I'm just about done here. So here's the summary of part 4. So we worked then with this Ecoinformatics framework to incorporate data streams from consultants and farmers and other sources to create this sort of versatile database. We built a database that was much larger than what we could generate with our own hands, and it really helped us then to sort out this sort of long struggle to understand the impact of ligas on cotton. And we think that farmers have been wasting money on unnecessary sprays and losing yield by not treating the populations as aggressively probably as they should. Okay, so last slide. I think applied insect ecologists, we have plenty of challenges. The problems that we work on are complex. Agricultural communities are not as simple as people like to pretend they are. Experimentation, I think, like any other approach in science, has both strengths and weaknesses. And what I've tried to argue is that we can find in observational studies and in these ecoinformatics approaches insights that can complement the weaknesses of experimentation. And I think that by pooling these approaches and working with them hand in hand, that we can make, I think, better progress in solving the problems. So, thanks very much. Yves Carrière and Pierre Dubleu are all biostatisticians, and that's a key part of the work I'll be presenting, but I won't go into it today, so I'm sort of going to really not do them justice, but the statistical issues are key as part of this work, and so that is definitely, their contributions are really super appreciated. Okay, so here's sort of a roadmap for what I'll be talking about. So first I'll try to define ecoinformatics, this approach of using data from farmers and consultants. I'll then sort of lead what I hope will be maybe a bit of a discussion about the strengths and weaknesses of experimental approaches versus observational approaches. And I'll try to focus that discussion a little bit by viewing it through the lens of a yield impact study. So one of the core studies that IPM researchers do, trying to quantify the relationship between pest density and crop yield. And then, essentially for the last chunk of our time, I'll walk through 2 examples that try to show how observational data sets can play complementary roles in research projects. So the first example will involve a very small, modest observational data set, and the second one will involve a larger data set coming from, again, the private farmers. And that'll essentially be my attempt to sort of share with you a proof of concept that this ecoinformatics approach can actually. And definitely feel free to interrupt. I'm happy to field questions or hear suggestions as we go along. Okay, so ecoinformatics, what exactly is it? Ecoinformatics, I think, is sort of a growth industry right now in the field of ecology. It's new, it's somewhat ill-defined still, but I would say that most ecoinformatics studies have most, if not all, of these characteristics. First, they tend to use pre-existing data. So they're almost all, to one degree or another, an exercise in data mining. Second, they often involve integration of data from multiple sources with all of the challenges associated with dealing with heterogeneous data sets. Usually the data are observational rather than experimental. Not always, but usually. Many ecoinformatics studies allow ecologists to address ecological processes that are occurring at large spatial or temporal scales at which experimentation is often quite difficult. Finally, ecoinformatics studies often involve relatively large quantities of data, and the fact that these data sets are large and heterogeneous typically means that to do one of these projects well, we need to have novel and efficient tools for organizing the data, managing the data, so database design is crucial, and we need typically novel tools for analyzing the data, so novel statistical approaches. So ecoinformatics then in a nutshell is often an endeavor that involves collaborations between computer scientists, between statisticians, and between ecologists to address these sort of broad scale questions in ecology. Okay, so if ecoinformatics then is focused on data mining, the first and absolute prerequisite is that there has to be some pre-existing set of data that are potentially useful. And in the field of pest management research, I think we have a tremendous opportunity to adopt this approach because there is a vast quantity of pre-existing data. And these are data that come from the routine sampling efforts that farmers and consultants are doing every day, every year out in commercial agriculture. So almost all farmers are monitoring their fields.
So I think we'll get started. Today I'm happy to present one of our own, Dr. Jay Rosenheim, who's been a member of the department for over 20 years. So he says he does not need an introduction, and you guys should be familiar with the excellent work that he and his lab members. So today we'll be talking about observational and ecoinformatics approaches in IPM research, expanding the applied insect ecologist toolkit. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. Well, I wanted to start by thanking Kelly and the graduate students for inviting me to talk. I think all of us run around and give talks at national meetings and sometimes in other departments, but it's kind of a special treat to be able to stay at home and present some of the more recent things. So the goal of the work that I'd like to talk about today is basically to sort of try and open a discussion with the community of applied insect ecologists about the possible advantages of sort of broadening the toolkit that we use a bit to move perhaps a little bit away from such a strong reliance on experimental work and to think a little bit instead about the maybe complementary values of using observational approaches. And in particular, approaches that use data that are not necessarily being collected by us, the researchers, with our own hands, but potentially using data that are being generated by farmers and consultants who are working in commercial and agriculture. So that's what I'll be talking about. Before I start the work, I wanted to acknowledge some of my collaborators. There are a lot of people who contributed to the work that I'll be presenting. So this first group, so Sarush, Billy, Yalwan, Moran, Francis, and Tanya, were basically all members of the lab about a year and a half ago, and we all worked together to do a review of the literature that I'll present in a few minutes. So that was work that we all worked on together. The second group, Rachel, Emily, Kim, Gail, Andy, and Andrew all contributed to the experimental field work that I'll be presenting. Pete Goodell is a IPM specialist, part of the UC IPM program. He was crucial in connecting me with consultants in the industry and with farmers, so his contribution was really essential. Jim Jones, the private software developer who's here today, he designed the database that made the whole project go, so we'll be talking about that a little bit later. And then this last group of individuals